King Louis XIV of France, also known as Louis the Great or the Sun King, was born on September 5, 1638, at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. He was the son of King Louis XIII and his wife, Anne of Austria. Louis became king at the age of 4 upon the death of his father in 1643, under the regency of his mother, Anne, and the influence of Cardinal Mazarin, the chief minister. The early years of his reign were marked by instability, as factions within the nobility and conflicts within the French court caused tensions. However, after Mazarin's death in 1661, Louis XIV took full control of the government and began to solidify his absolute rule. Louis XIV is most famous for his embodiment of the concept of absolute monarchy. He famously said, "L'état c'est moi, I am the state," which reflected his belief that the monarchy and the state were one and the same. His reign, which lasted an unprecedented 72 years, from 1643 until his death in 1715, is the longest of any European monarch. During his rule, he centralized power in the French monarchy and reduced the influence of the nobility, asserting his control over all branches of government. One of Louis XIV's major achievements was the construction of the Palace of Versailles. Beginning in 1661, he transformed a hunting lodge into a grandiose symbol of his absolute power. The palace became the political and cultural heart of France, with the king using it to both impress and control the nobility. By requiring the nobility to spend time at Versailles, Louis XIV could closely monitor their activities and ensure they remained loyal. The elaborate court rituals at Versailles also reinforced the king's supremacy and the grandeur of the monarchy. Louis XIV's foreign policy was aggressive and expansionist. He sought to strengthen France's position in Europe through a series of wars. His wars were often costly, but they allowed him to extend French territory. Among the most notable conflicts were the War of Devolution, 1667 to 1668, the Dutch War, 1672 to 1678, and the War of the League of Augsburg, 1688 to 1697. While he did achieve some territorial gains, his wars also drained France's resources and left the country with significant debts. Domestically, Louis XIV implemented policies that enhanced royal authority. He controlled the French military and used it as a tool for expanding and maintaining French power. He also centralized the economy, imposing strict regulations on commerce, agriculture, and industry to ensure that they served the interests of the monarchy. He made significant efforts to strengthen the economy, such as supporting the development of the textile industry, building infrastructure, and promoting mercantilism. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his finance minister, played a key role in these reforms. However, Louis XIV's reign was also marked by religious intolerance. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted religious freedom to Protestants in France. This act led to the persecution of the Huguenots, many of whom fled the country, and significantly weakened France's economy by removing a large portion of its skilled workforce. The decision was part of his broader policy of religious uniformity, which sought to make Catholicism the sole faith of France. Despite his successes, Louis XIV's reign had significant downsides. The cost of his wars, extravagant court life, and construction projects led to severe financial strain on the country. By the time of his death in 1715, France was deeply in debt. Moreover, the centralization of power left little room for the development of other political institutions, which would later contribute to political unrest. The lavishness of his court and his personal spending further exacerbated social inequalities, leading to widespread discontent among the lower classes. Louis XIV died on September 1, 1715, at the age of 76. He was succeeded by his great-grandson, Louis XV, as his own son, Louis the Dauphin, had died earlier. Louis XIV's legacy is complex. He is often remembered for his monumental achievements in art, culture, and architecture, as well as for his efforts to make France the dominant European power of the 17th century. However, his reign also sowed the seeds for the economic difficulties and social unrest that would culminate in the French Revolution later in the 18th century. Following Louis XIV's death in 1715, the impact of his reign continued to be felt for decades, particularly through the financial burden and administrative legacy he left behind. Louis XIV had spent vast amounts on wars and the opulent court life of Versailles, which, while consolidating his power and influence, also drained the state's coffers. By the time of his passing, France was in a precarious financial position, with national debt skyrocketing due to the prolonged wars and expensive infrastructure projects. The lavish expenditures at the palace, the cost of foreign campaigns, and the construction of Versailles had placed immense strain on the French economy, setting the stage for future crises. While Louis XIV's reign elevated France to a position of great political and cultural dominance, it also created a framework of governance that, in hindsight, would contribute to the failure of the monarchy. His efforts to centralize power and eliminate the influence of the nobility left the monarchy vulnerable when he passed. With the king's death, France was left without a strong central authority, as Louis XV, the great-grandson who succeeded him, was only 5 years old at the time and required a regency. This absence of a firm, experienced ruler caused political instability in the short term, leading to power struggles between court factions and further weakening the monarchy. Louis XIV's approach to governance, an absolute monarchy where all power resided with the king, had left the nobility weak and dependent on the royal favor. While this might have seemed effective during his lifetime, the nobility's diminishing influence and the lack of any significant checks on royal power made it difficult for later French monarchs to govern effectively. As the 18th century progressed, France's social inequalities grew and the peasantry, burdened by heavy taxes, became increasingly discontented. The court's extravagance at Versailles, a symbol of Louis XIV's reign, stood in stark contrast to the poverty and hardship faced by the common people. In the cultural sphere, Louis XIV's reign had a lasting influence on France and Europe. He was a major patron of the arts, and his court at Versailles became a center for the finest artistic expression. Under his patronage, French culture flourished, with notable contributions in literature, music, and architecture. The arts became closely linked with the monarchy, with figures such as playwright Molière, composer Jean-Baptiste Lully, and painter Charles Le Brun gaining prominence. Louis XIV also sponsored the construction of grand palaces and public works, contributing to the development of classical French architecture. The intellectual atmosphere at Louis XIV's court was also significant, as his reign coincided with the early days of the Age of Enlightenment. Though Louis XIV was a strong Catholic and did not support the rise of Enlightenment ideas, the cultural and intellectual institutions of his time laid the groundwork for future philosophical developments. Thinkers like René Descartes and Blaise Pascal, though not directly associated with Louis XIV's court, were part of the intellectual environment that thrived during his reign. However, Louis's policies, such as the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, were in direct opposition to the intellectual currents that were beginning to question traditional forms of authority. Louis XIV's reign also saw the consolidation of French colonial power. France expanded its territories in North America, the Caribbean, and Asia during his time, though these colonial endeavors were often overshadowed by the European wars. French trade networks expanded, and colonies such as New France, modern-day Canada, were further established and fortified. These colonies would later play a crucial role in France's imperial endeavors throughout the 18th century, though they too were affected by the fiscal difficulties of the French monarchy. Despite the apparent splendor and success of his rule, the latter years of Louis XIV's reign were marked by increasing dissatisfaction and unrest. The long wars, heavy taxes, and strict control of the economy made it difficult for the lower classes to thrive. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which had granted Protestant Huguenots religious freedom, exacerbated religious tensions within the kingdom. The persecution of Protestants weakened France by driving out many skilled workers and professionals who were a significant part of the country's economy. This decision, along with his other absolutist measures, alienated many of his subjects and sowed the seeds of future rebellion. As Louis XIV aged, his health declined, and the problems of his reign became more apparent. He spent his final years suffering from chronic illness and a sense of exhaustion from the constant demands of governance. His death marked the end of an era, but the consequences of his rule were felt long after. The legacy of Louis XIV is complex. He was a monarch who transformed France into a major European power and elevated its culture and prestige. However, the financial mismanagement, social inequalities, and political centralization that characterized his reign also made France vulnerable to the turbulence that would follow in the 18th century, culminating in the French Revolution. In summary, Louis XIV's reign was a defining period in French history, during which the monarchy reached its zenith in terms of power, cultural influence, and territorial expansion. His creation of an absolute monarchy and his lavish court at Versailles left a lasting imprint on French society. Yet, his extravagant spending, aggressive foreign policies, and religious intolerance also planted the seeds for future political and economic turmoil. Though he is remembered as one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, his legacy is a reminder of the delicate balance required to maintain political stability and the costs of absolute power. Louis XIV's reign, while often viewed as a golden age of French power and culture, ultimately left the monarchy ill-prepared for the challenges that would arise in the decades following his death. The long-lasting impact of his policies, especially those related to governance, finance, and social inequality, would shape the course of French history well into the 18th century. One of the most significant long-term effects of Louis XIV's reign was the immense debt that France accumulated due to his wars and lavish spending on the court at Versailles. By the time Louis XIV passed away in 1715, France's national debt had reached astronomical levels, putting a significant strain on the country's economy. The wars Louis XIV fought, particularly the series of conflicts throughout his reign, drained both the treasury and the resources of the French people. While his military campaigns resulted in territorial gains for France, they also exhausted the nation's manpower and wealth. By the end of his reign, France was left with a weakened economy, high taxes, and an overburdened peasantry. This financial instability would contribute to the unrest that would eventually lead to the French Revolution in 1789, nearly a century after his death. Louis XIV's legacy also played a key role in the growing resentment toward the monarchy. The nobles, who had been marginalized during his reign, would gradually regain more influence under subsequent rulers, but the monarchy's control over the nation would never again be as absolute as it had been under the Sun King. The social inequalities that were entrenched during Louis XIV's rule, particularly the lavish lifestyle of the royal court compared to the poverty of the common people, created a deep divide that fueled revolutionary sentiment. The opulence of Versailles, where Louis XIV and his court lived in extravagant luxury, became a symbol of the excesses of the French monarchy and the discontent felt by the lower classes. While Louis XIV's reign ended on a note of financial and social instability, his cultural contributions continued to resonate throughout Europe. The arts, particularly painting, architecture, music, and literature, thrived under his patronage. The grandiose architecture of Versailles and other royal palaces became models for other European monarchies. The French court was also the center of artistic innovation, and many of the leading figures in the arts during this period were closely associated with Louis XIV's court. Under his reign, French became the dominant language of diplomacy and culture across Europe, further cementing France's position as the cultural epicenter of the continent. Moreover, Louis XIV's influence extended beyond the borders of France. His foreign policy, although aggressive, shaped European politics for much of the 17th century. The alliances, treaties, and conflicts that emerged during his reign set the stage for future wars in Europe. The balance of power in Europe was often dictated by France's actions, and Louis XIV's military strategies were studied by future leaders and military commanders. However, by the time of his death, the idea of divine right monarchy had begun to be questioned more and more. The growth of Enlightenment ideas, which emphasized reason, individual rights, and limited government, stood in stark contrast to the absolute monarchy that Louis XIV had epitomized. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, whose works would become central to revolutionary thought, were critical of the centralization of power that had characterized Louis XIV's reign. The absolutist model of governance he championed would be directly challenged by the political theories that emerged in the late 18th century, leading to the downfall of the French monarchy. Louis XIV's rule is often depicted as a period of unchallenged royal power, yet it also served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute authority. Despite his remarkable achievements, his policies left France in a state of disrepair, both financially and politically. His centralization of power, while initially strengthening the monarchy, left the state vulnerable when royal authority weakened in the subsequent generation. The burdens of war, debt, and taxation contributed to the fracturing of French society, and the lavish lifestyle he cultivated at Versailles contrasted sharply with the hardships of the common people, providing a spark for revolution. The grandiosity and decadence of his reign became a source of disdain in the years that followed. The events of the French Revolution, which began in 1789, were in many ways a direct consequence of the inequalities and tensions that Louis XIV's rule exacerbated. His policies laid the foundation for the fiscal crises that his successor struggled to address, ultimately culminating in the overthrow